Build will begin in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, begin. Warp in a probe. Warp in a probe. Warp in a pylon. Then send scout probe. Warp in a probe. Then game timer reads 1 minute. Warp in a probe. Chronoboost Nexus. Warp in a probe. Chronoboost Nexus. Warp in a probe. Warp in a probe. Warp in a gateway. Warp in a probe. Warp in an assimilator. Chronoboost Nexus. Warp in a probe. Warp in a pylon. Warp in a probe. Send 3 probes to gas. Warp in a probe. Warp in a probe. Warp in a Cybernetics Core. Warp in a Zealot. Warp in a probe with Chronoboost. Warp in a probe. Warp in a pylon. Warp in a probe. Research Warpgate with Chronoboost. Then warp in a Stalker. Warp in a probe. Supply 27/34. Warp in final probe. Warp in a Robotics Facility. Chronoboost Cybernetics Core. Warp in a Zealot. Warp in a gateway. Warp in a gateway. Send scout probe to forward pylon placement. Warp in a gateway. Warp in a Zealot. Warp in a pylon. Supply 32/34. Warp in a Warp Prism with Chronoboost. Warp in a Forward Pylon. Warp in a pylon. Chronoboost Robotics Facility. Transform gateways to Warpgates. Load Warp Prism and attack. Good luck and good game.